On the last evening in March 1968, the stage was set. Shortly before 9 p.m. Washington time, in the midst of last-minute electronic preparations, President Johnson put the finishing touches on his address to the nation. Finally, with the reassuring presence of his family seated nearby, the president was ready to deliver one of the most important speeches of his entire life, a speech that would alter the course of world history.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. No other question so preoccupies our people. No other dream so absorbs the 250 million human beings who live in that part of the world. No other goal motivates American policy in Southeast Asia.
First, addressing himself to the continuing problem of Vietnam, the president outlined plans for a unilateral American de-escalation of that conflict.
Tonight, I have ordered our aircraft and our naval vessels to make no attacks on North Vietnam, except in the area north of the demilitarized zone where the continuing enemy buildup directly threatens Allied forward positions and where the movement of their troops and supplies are clearly related to that threat. The area in which we're stopping our attacks includes almost 90% of North Vietnam's population and most of its territory. Thus, there will be no attacks around the principal populated areas or in the food-producing areas of North Vietnam. Even this very limited bombing of the North could come to an early end if our restraint is matched by restraint in Hanoi.
The president issued an appeal for unity among the American people and went on to speak in moving words of the future he foresees America attaining. But it was in the final moments of his speech that he voiced the syllables which stunned the nation and reverberated around the world. To a disbelieving audience of countless millions, President Johnson announced the decision that had been many months in the making, but only resolved within himself in the final hours of March.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
That courtesy of the White House Naval Photographic Unit as we look back 50 years ago here on C-SPAN and C-SPAN 3's American History TV, 1968, America in Turmoil. And we want to begin with the announcement by Senator Eugene McCarthy in November of 1967 to seek the Democratic nomination. The Tet Offensive began on January 30th of 1968. Richard Nixon formally enters the presidential race on February the 1st. And George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, enters on February the 8th. President Johnson wins the New Hampshire primary, but narrowly against Eugene McCarthy. And then, just a few days later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy entering the Democratic race, announcing here in Washington in the Russell Senate Office Building. 2 weeks later, President Lyndon Johnson stunning the nation, announcing that he will not seek re-election. Then on April the 4th, Dr. Martin Luther King assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, entering the race on April 27, 1968. And then Senator Robert F. Kennedy winning the California primary, shot after midnight on the day of victory, and dies on June the 6th, 1968. Richard Nixon accepting the Republican nomination in August of that year. Later in August, Hubert Humphrey accepting the Democratic nomination in Chicago amidst the riots. Richard Nixon is elected president on November 5th, 1968. We want to welcome our guest, Barbara Perry from the University of Virginia Miller Center. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Pat Buchanan, who, for the purposes of this discussion, was a Nixon aide in
Buchanan
1968.
Of the Nixon campaign.
Pat Buchanan, let me begin by asking you about the announcement of Lyndon Johnson, March 31st. Where were you?
Well, on the Saturday before that Sunday, I was at Nixon's apartment. We were having a debate on Nixon's speech on Vietnam, which he was going to give that afternoon. Ray Price was there, Richard Whalen, and I was there. We were having an argument. Nixon was moving toward a more dovish position on the war, or about to, when we got word from CBS that Lyndon Johnson had asked for time, and Sunday night. So what Nixon was going to Wisconsin the next day, and he told me, Pat, I want you to be out at LaGuardia, the private terminal. When I come back from the Wisconsin, he was making an appearance out there for the primary, to brief me on what Johnson said before the press gets to me. So I was sitting in a limousine on the tarmac at LaGuardia. Had Nixon's African-American driver was there. He starts yelling, I knew it was going to happen. I knew it was going to happen when LBJ announced I'm not going to run again. I got out of the limo and I ran down toward the jet Nixon had come in on, and the press was walking over to the jet. And I got on the plane and I told Nixon, I said, Johnson's out, he's not going to run again. Nixon stepped out to the top of the steps on the plane and said, I guess it's the year of the dropout. George Romney had dropped out of New Hampshire on him. Nelson Rockefeller had decided not to run earlier in March. So that was the, and we drove in to Nixon's apartment and we talked going in, and I remember telling him, I thought Hubert Humphrey would be a tougher nominee, and I thought Humphrey would get the nomination.
He did not expect to challenge Senator Robert Kennedy?
Oh, he didn't think Kennedy was going to win the nomination. I didn't either.
Barbara Perry, let's go back to the announcement of Eugene McCarthy to enter the Democratic race. Who was he, and why was his voice so important in the '68 campaign?
Eugene McCarthy was the senator from the Midwest. He had been a professor of economics and sociology. He was very professorial in his demeanor, very cool, some might even have said aloof. But he entered the race as the peace candidate. He was the anti-war candidate, and immediately got a coterie of students to support him. Some of them who might have been in the hippie realm shaved their beards and cut their hair and called each other clean for Gene.
Be clean for Gene.
Be clean for Gene, exactly, Pat. And so he was the young people's candidate, the intellectual candidate, the upper middle class candidate for the Democrats. And certainly if you put the personality of Gene McCarthy next to Lyndon Johnson, and if they thought that they would be running to get the nomination against the incumbent president, you couldn't have found two more different personalities. But he was definitely the peace candidate, the anti-war candidate going into New Hampshire, and comes within 7 percentage points of the incumbent, which is part of the reason Johnson drops out.
You have to remember that, I can't believe it, it was political malpractice. Johnson's name was not on the ballot. He won the race with 49% as a write-in. Later on, it was discovered that the hardline New Hampshireites, half of those who voted for Gene McCarthy, thought Johnson had not been tough enough on the war. But I will say, in April 2nd, when they got to Wisconsin, McCarthy just wiped up the floor with Johnson there. And I think Johnson's guys had polls, and they knew that was coming.
They also knew that Johnson was running at about 35% approval rating at that point. So between that and the Tet Offensive aftermath, and that he's going to have to boost up the troop numbers in Vietnam, it was just not looking good. And plus, Johnson worried he'd suffer another heart attack in another term. So he was really concerned.
You know, Nixon announced, you mentioned on February 1st, we flew up secretly on the 31st. Nixon registered in Nashua under the name Benjamin Chapman. We took him into a motel. And so he announced then, as you mentioned, February 1st. February 2nd, it's a single column story in the New York Times. But the big picture on the New York Times, it's about the Tet Offensive, is about the Saigon police chief. He's got that small revolver right next to the head of the Viet Cong, and where he fired and killed him. And Eddie Adams won a Pulitzer for that for that photograph, but that really dramatized it. The Vietnam War was
galvanizing moments, wasn't it?
It certainly was, yeah.
And we talked about that last week. This full series, by the way, available on our website at cspan.org. Pat Buchanan, let's talk about Richard Nixon. He lost the presidency in 1960. He loses his bid for governor in 1962. The headline, The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon. He moves back to New York in the mid-60s. Why did he run in 1968, and what was the state of the Republican Party that year?
Well, in 1964, Goldwater, of course, was wiped out, and Nixon was the lead surrogate for Goldwater. So Nixon was basically a two-time loser and was considered a political loser. And so he moved to New York, and what he did is I went to work for him, 1965, 66, January 66. And Nixon told me then, I said, sir, I want to get aboard early, you know, if you're going to run for president. He said, I'll hire you for 1 year. If we don't do well in these off-year elections, nomination won't be worth anything. So we went around 5 weeks in 1966. Nixon campaigned, paid for it himself, got his own plane. We went around, I think he must have been in 35 states. And what happens, it's one of the great comebacks. That it sprung back. Nixon helped pick up 47 seats in the House. I think they got 3 seats in the Senate, 6 governorship, hundreds of legislators. Greatest Republican victory since 1946. And so Nixon is, and when I remember Tom Evans came up to me and said, I had been an editorial writer in St. Louis. He said, I don't think you're going back to St. Louis. I said, I don't think so early. So what Nixon did then is he declared a 6-month moratorium on politics. He said, I've been in the limelight. He'd gotten into a straight head-up battle with Johnson at the end of 66. Johnson had attacked him in the White House. And so Nixon pulled himself completely out. And one of the reasons I said, sir, Romney was running first in the polls then. He was ahead of Johnson and ahead of Nixon. So I said, is it wise to give him all that space and time while you're going nowhere? And so Nixon says, you know, I think I need to get out of the public arena for a while. Let them chew on him for a little while, which meant the press. And the press went after Romney because he was the only one out there. And by mid-1967, and especially, I think it was around September 1, where Romney made his famous statements, when I was over in Vietnam, I was brainwashed. George Romney, I was brainwashed by the diplomats and military. And I remember Eugene McCarthy, in character with him, caustic fellow, he said, in Romney's case, you wouldn't need a complete brainwashing. A light rinse would have done the job.
Well, along those lines, I want to take you back to that time period and a very young Pat Buchanan on the campaign trail with Richard Nixon, then the former vice president. We'll watch this.
It seems to me to be a pretty magnificent turnout. I think I'd estimate at least we've had somewhere in the neighborhood of 600-700 go by already. And I would estimate that we probably have more than 3,000 before the afternoon is over.
Are these people all Republicans, or are they a mixture, or what do you think?
I couldn't say looking out here. You can't tell a Republican from a Democrat or an independent out here, but I would assume it's really just a good cross-section of the people of Manchester, frankly.
I was just wondering how many of these people you think are going to be are essentially sympathetic to Mr. Nixon? How many are kind of potential voters?
We don't know how many coming in, but we hope they all will be going out.
There you are. There's 3. How's that? 1, 2, 3. That's 50. All right. How you doing? You a friend of Dave?
Nixon.
Ah!
All the way.
You tell me, is this fellow a good chairman up here? I'm trying to...
Darn good fellow in every way.
You really think so?
I really think so.
Yeah.
He's a good guy.
All right, good. Well, as a matter of fact, that's what we hear. We got a lot of people said, well, he's too young to be chairman. And I said, well, we need a fellow that's sort of a goer. Would you agree?
I will agree 100%, yes, sir.
Good. Are you on his payroll?
No, I'm retired.
All right. You were in the service?
In the First World War.
You were in the First World War. What, the big one? Right? That's
Yes, right.
What division were you in?
The 73rd Division.
73rd Division.
Heavy artillery.
Heavy artillery. Oh, yeah, the big...
Battery B, 73rd Artillery.
Yeah, those were the Sprint 75s you used, weren't they?
We used the...
Or did you have another kind of a...
We trained on the naval guns.
Oh, the naval guns, right?
The big guns.
The Coast Artillery, sure.
I was in New Hampshire Coast Artillery. I was enlisted in the Hampshire National Guard.
Yeah. Well, gee, you know, it's hard to realize we've had so many wars since then. We thought that was the end of the last one, and then we had World War II, and then we had Korea, and now we got Vietnam. Let's hope we can get rid of them, huh?
Let's do something.
Let's do something. Right. Good to see you.
Awful nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you. What?
From February 1968 campaigning in New Hampshire, and Pat Buchanan, you sound the same.
Well, thank you. That was at St. Anselm's, and we had a great thing put together by the late Nick Ruey, one of the great advance men. We had 3,000 people at St. Anselm's, and President and Mrs. Nixon went all through the receiving line. But there's a sad anecdote there. That fellow who was the chairman of our campaign in New Hampshire was Dave Sterling. Very young guy. We picked him because they had all these princes in New Hampshire. We didn't want to antagonize any of them. We got this young state legislator. He died a couple of years later, I think, or very soon after, in a bad automobile accident. But he did a great job up there. And I will say this, our campaign in '68 with Nixon, we'd studied 60, Teddy White's book, how Nixon overdid it, ran himself into the ground. So did Jack Kennedy. And we would bring him into New Hampshire for a day, 2 days or maybe 3 days, then fly him down to Key Biscayne where he could relax with Bebe Rebozo and take it easy, and then go into Wisconsin. So you paced him very well. We knew it was a marathon. But that event at St. Anselm's, I can still remember it. I mean, he was just tremendously well advanced. We're up there whipping, everybody to come out, and look how many came out voluntarily, et cetera. But we had a terrific crowd, 3,000 people. And that was the kind of event Nixon wanted to do, It just was excellent.
And Barbara Perry, that exchange, by the way, with a World War I veteran, and he makes mention of Vietnam. Clearly, that was the driving issue of 1968. Can you explain what was going on here in this country, how Americans were viewing the war, and why they were turning against President Johnson?
Right. Well, we mentioned the Tet Offensive. That was in January of 1968, and I'm glad actually there are no videos of me from 1968, but I will say that I was a 12-year-old in the 6th grade. My brother was 10 years older than I, and graduating from college, a small Catholic college in Louisville where we grew up that spring. And he was told by his draft board, you'll graduate May 15th, is it? Well, you'll be drafted by June 1st. And my dad was a World War II vet. My brother was patriotic. There was no way he was going to deny going to the draft, but in the end, he served for 4 years in the Air Force. But that was the talk around our dinner table, because he was at college in his hometown, and here I was, a 12-year-old, soaking this up. What was happening in America was that boys like my brother, girlfriends and their boyfriends knew they were going. Fathers were going. The draft was up and running, and we were going to end up with over 500,000 people serving the military in Vietnam, and 1,000 were dying every week. So the campuses were in an uproar. The streets were in an uproar. We didn't talk about race, but we need to add that into it as well. So the country was coming apart, and particularly over this issue, and particularly with the students over the draft, and the casualty figures that were coming out of Vietnam. 202 is the area code 748-8000. That's our line for Democrats, and 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and we have a line for Independents. 1968, America in Turmoil, and joining us, Barbara Perry, who is the Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia Miller Center, and Pat Buchanan. You wanted to respond.
Yeah, I had a brother who went over to Vietnam with the 101st Airborne. He went over, he didn't go in December, he broke his foot in his first jump, but he went over in January just in time for the Tet Offensive there, and he was over there for that year, and you're right. I mean, even before then, when I was in St. Louis as a journalist in 1965 at Globe Democrat, at Washington University out there, called the Harvard of the Middle West, I was at teach-in speaking on behalf in favor of Johnson and Kennedy's policies out there, but the demonstrations, it was already it wasn't violent by then, but there was real hostility especially on the elite campuses. And they had SDS, I remember them marching. I would go down and talk to some of those kids in front of the buildings before they became violent. And you're right, the war was the major issue going on, but I will say, after Dr. King was assassinated, they had riots in 100 cities, my hometown here in D.C. It was partly burned down, 7th Street, 14th Street. They had Marines, armed troops in the city. So that the law and order and the war in Vietnam became the issues.
And that's my next question. To try to put this in perspective, you have President Johnson, who narrowly won the New Hampshire primary on March the 12th. Then you had Senator Kennedy entering the race on March the 16th. LBJ drops out on March the 31st. And then Dr. King is assassinated on April the 4th, all within a 4-week period.
It's hard to comprehend, I think, for people now to be able to see what was compacted into that, in essence, a month's time, and so to think that the country seemed to be coming apart. And again, sort of a personal anecdote. My dad, who was a lifelong Democrat, began saying, "I'm really fearful for the country now. I'm fearful about what's happening in the streets," and voted for Nixon in 1968 because he thought he was the law and order man. He was the man who would bring law and order back to our streets and bring our country together, interestingly enough. And the other thing about Vietnam, that we talked about the Tet Offensive, the United States won the Tet Offensive, but it was the offensive of the North and the Viet Cong in the South. And to see that movement into the South of the North Vietnamese regulars and the Viet Cong was so fearsome to the American people, and to see that in their living rooms. And we want to talk about the role of the media, because Pat's telling us these great stories about how the Nixon administration, prior to going into office, how the Nixon campaign knew how to use media by 1968. Right. And people were seeing this in their living rooms.
Yeah, and Cronkite, I believe it was in February, he had gone over to Vietnam, and he came back and said, we're mired in a stalemate. And I think many in the American elite media really had broken on the war, had really decided that it was an unwinnable war. And they tended to move at that point, and by the time Nixon took over, they would move heavily into the camp, basically, of the demonstrators. And we always thought of them as really allies of the demonstrators by 1969. But there's something else in March that you don't have in there. It was stunning for us. I was with Dwight Chapin, you had a picture of him there, in a room, I think it was 21st of March or something like that, when Nelson Rockefeller was going to announce for president. And Nixon told us, he didn't like to watch these on television himself, you guys watch and then tell me what he said, and then Nixon would get our reaction. And Rockefeller, I went in and I said, Rockefeller's not running. And he sort of dropped out. And so, and that's where Nixon got his statement, the year of the dropout. It was Romney, Rockefeller, and Johnson. And all of a sudden, we had this clear path to the nomination. And to your point, you got to realize that the revolution in 1968 was largely contained in that gigantic FDR coalition inside the Democratic Party. George Wallace was a populist Southerner, tough on pro-segregation. He was ripping the South, the basis of the Democratic Party, apart. Humphrey and Johnson were by then the center of the party. Bobby Kennedy had moved dramatically to the left, and with Eugene McCarthy and the George McGovern, that wing of the party, and all three were going to be represented in Chicago.
And very quickly, wasn't Governor Spiro Agnew a Rockefeller supporter and stunned?
Governor Agnew was sitting, he brought in reporters and said he was for Rockefeller. He's got the governors for Rockefeller, the citizens for Rockefeller. He headed it up, announced it for 3 weeks, and he's waiting, and he calls in the reporters when Rockefeller's going to announce, and he's going to have a major role in it. And when Rockefeller never called him and went out and said, I'm not running, Agnew was left with egg all over his face. And as someone wrote, we caught him on the first hop. Nixon was right on the phone. Come on up, Governor, and talk to us. And he came up, and well, you will get to it, I'm sure. But Agnew was regarded, he ran against Mahoney in '66. Your home is your castle, basically a Democrat who opposed open housing. And Agnew supported it. So Agnew was seen as something of a liberal governor, except for the riots, where he was very, very hard line. And that's one of the reasons he wound up on the ticket.
Let's get to it. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Rockefeller thought he still might have a chance at the convention, and was going around to governors saying, support me, and went to Agnew, and Agnew had thought, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this again. Fool me once, shame on me.
We did get one governor, Governor Schaefer of Pennsylvania. And I remember, I think it was Jules Wickover was covering us then. And there was a beer commercial in those days that if Schaefer's the one beer to have if you're having only one.
Let's go to Leo in Joliet, Illinois. Democrats line here at the table. Barbara Perry and Pat Buchanan.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I want to thank God for C-SPAN and thank Mr. Buchanan for the way he relates American history to us. I was a student in high school at the time, and when we understand the portent of this country having been created, and it fills us not with pride, but with compassion, understanding, and great thanksgiving to Almighty God that America stands still as a guardian of freedom on the earth. Thank you, Mr. Buchanan, and thank you, Miss. I appreciate everything. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you for the call. A comment, not a question. Response?
Well, I'll comment to that very optimistic view of 1968, and it is one that my colleague at the Miller Center, Mike Nelson, also a political scientist, shares. And he wrote a book called Resilient America about 1968, rather than focusing on the fact that we were coming apart. And Pat's already explained what was happening in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was coming apart. The New Deal coalition was coming apart. Riots in the streets and on the campuses. And yet there is a resilience in America, thank goodness, and in our Constitution and in our government that we were able to survive and move forward.
Pat Buchanan, I'm going to bring something else to the table, because in an interview with James Jones, who you know was a longtime aide to LBJ in his mid to late 20s, he said that he traveled with President Johnson on the afternoon of March 31st, went to Vice President Humphrey's apartment, he didn't have a residence at the time, told him to read the speech, said that he wasn't going to run for re-election. Humphrey was shaken and said, the president said, if you're going to run, you need to start now. And Humphrey reportedly said, I lost to one Kennedy and I'm going to lose to another. And I mention that because Vice President Humphrey did not announce until April 27th, almost a month after LBJ announced he would not seek another term.
Well, it could have been. We felt, for example, use an example of Rockefeller. Rockefeller didn't get in because Nixon would have crushed him in all the primaries. Now, my guess is Humphrey might have delayed till then. But Humphrey, I mean, to me anyhow, Bobby Kennedy was not Jack Kennedy. He didn't have the charm, the charisma, the centrism about him. By then he had moved to the left. He was anti-war, very sharp-edged. But I always felt that even after California, when Bobby Kennedy won, that when they got to Chicago, that Humphrey would take it. That Humphrey had enough, I mean, he had the machine put together for him, he had the president behind him, and Conley and all these other folks. I thought he would win it, and I did not know that he was that apprehensive that he could not beat Robert Kennedy.
Barbara Perry, it's a what if, we know.
It is one of those what ifs of history, but just I jotted down last night that when Bobby Kennedy died on June the 6th, Hubert Humphrey had already amassed over 500 delegates, Robert Kennedy 393, Gene McCarthy 258. And for what was left of the New Deal coalition, Humphrey had those people behind him. He had labor, he had the rank and file of the party. So it's unlikely that even if Robert Kennedy had lived, he certainly would have beaten Gene McCarthy at the convention. Sure. It's unlikely he would have beaten Humphrey. Also remember how devastated Humphrey was that Johnson wasn't going to run. I understand that meeting at his apartment after Johnson announced, or just actually I think Johnson went before he announced and went to that apartment to tell him. He was in tears about it. And he also had that ambivalence that he wasn't going to bash the president he was serving. And of course that's in the end, in part, what caused Humphrey to lose the race.
And just down the street in the Russell Senate office building, not far from where we're at, is where Senator Robert F. Kennedy made his announcement on March the 16th, 1968.
There have been speculations, Senator, that this is opportunism on your part. That McCarthy had the courage to go into New Hampshire while you hesitated. Now that you're after his glory, would you address yourself to...
Well, first, as I said, I don't believe that I could...
And hear the question.
You mean I have to repeat that? A lot of nasty things involved. The question was whether the charge has been raised about the question of whether this is opportunistic of my coming into the contest at this time after Senator McCarthy had gone into the New Hampshire primary. As I said, I've spoken on these issues and these questions for a number of years and how I feel about them. I felt, and I think it was generally accepted, that if I had gone into the primary in New Hampshire, if I had won the primary in New Hampshire, or if I had done well in the primary in New Hampshire, it would have been felt at that time that this was a personal struggle. It would have been written in the press that this was a personal struggle. Every time I have spoken on Vietnam over the period of the past several years, every time I have spoken on what I think needs to be done as far as the cities are concerned, it's been put in the context of a personal struggle between myself and President Johnson. Therefore, we would get away from what the issues are which divide this country. I think the New Hampshire primary established that the division that exists in this country, the division that exists in the Democratic Party are there, that I haven't brought that about. That what has brought that about is what President Johnson, the policies that are being followed by President Johnson. Now, as far as what is happening at the moment, I can't believe that anybody thinks that this is a pleasant struggle from now on, or that I'm asking for a free ride. I've got 5 months ahead of me as far as the convention is concerned. I'm going to go into primaries. I'm going to present my case to the American people. I'm going to go all across this country.
Pat Buchanan, again, that was 4 days after the New Hampshire primary and 2 weeks before LBJ dropped out.
The allegation of opportunism was really in the air on Robert Kennedy there. When he got into it, I remember Murray Kempton, who was a great writer of the New York Post, who really admired Bobby Kennedy. He said he's coming down from the hills to shoot the wounded, and what Bobby Kennedy is doing proves that St. Patrick did not drive all the snakes out of Ireland. It was very rough on Bobby Kennedy, and people forget Bobby Kennedy was ruthless on LBJ in that interim between 2 weeks before LBJ resigned. He accused Johnson of appealing to the darker impulses of the American spirit. And I've got a memo I sent to Nixon. I said, this is astounding how ruthless he is on the president, because we assume the president's going to stay in. And so, of course, Mr. Nixon said, keep gathering that. We've got some better quotes than that. But I think Mr. Nixon, believed more than I did that we might wind up with Robert Kennedy as the candidate, and you'd have another Kennedy run. But again, as I said, I always thought that Humphrey was the candidate who had great depth inside the left wing of the Democratic Party from that 48 convention. He was Mr. Civil Rights. He had put the Civil Rights Act on the floor of the U.S. Senate and run it through for LBJ. He had labor. He could bring together the anti-war groups, as eventually he did, along with the center of the Democratic Party. Wallace groups, the South, the Deep South was gone.
Robert from Frostburg, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Buchanan and the lady, as well as you, Mr. Scully. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I don't think Mr. Nixon gets the credit he deserves. Even though I voted most of the time with Democrats, I think Nixon was a very good president. But what overshadowed his goodness as a president was the Vietnam War, Watergate, and his personality complexes. But some of the decisions he made with civil rights and other issues, EPA, and Nixon was a very good president. Just those three things overshadow his presidency. Thank you for the call. Barbara Perry.
Well, we now look back at Nixon, and Nixon, I think, thought of himself in many ways as as sort of a moderate Republican, and he was viewed in those days in 1968 as a moderate Republican. He could be viewed in the center between someone like Reagan. We haven't talked about his entrance into the mix, but I'm sure we will, and then Rockefeller on the left side of the party. So when we look back at Richard Nixon's almost 1.5 terms in office, we can see a number of the things that he did that people now on the liberal side say, good for him.
He was, I would call Nixon a progressive Republican in that tradition. Certainly domestically, he inherited the Vietnam War, obviously, after 5 years. And when, as you say, there were 31,000 dead when Nixon came into office. But the gentleman said he was for Nixon, although he didn't vote for him. But he's exactly right. The American people agreed with the gentleman. Richard Nixon, after all, won 49 states in 1972, won over 61% of the vote, I believe, against Senator McGovern, who was an anti-war candidate. So Nixon's policy of getting out of Vietnam, but giving the Vietnamese a fighting chance to survive on their own as a free and independent country. By and large, even though it was protested by hundreds of thousands in the streets here, was a policy that was supported by the American people and obviously rewarded in 1972 with that landslide.
And you mentioned Ronald Reagan, who was a first-term governor in California, elected in 1966. He traveled to Iowa in the fall of 1967. Here's what Governor Reagan said back then.
You know, there'd be one way to make sure that crime doesn't pay. Let government run it. I remember way back in 1964, when they said all the way with LBJ, and now we know what he meant. He has his troubles. There's Bobby Kennedy. Bobby has him so nervous about the upcoming convention, he's thinking of putting the country in his wife's name. But Bobby was just trying to be helpful. He said he wanted a Johnson-Humphrey ticket, but he didn't say where to. Every time he offers to help, a voice from the White House says, "Please, Bobby, we'd rather lose it ourselves." He's one of those rare people, Bobby is, who can always say exactly the right thing at the right time to the wrong person. Now, if it seems that I'm picking unduly on the opposition, please note that I'm picking on the leadership of the Democratic Party, because I'm sure that there are millions of fine, patriotic members of that party who are deeply disturbed with what has taken place in the nation's capital as we moved from 1960 and the new frontier to the Great Society. They know that the Great Society is not the wave of the future. It's the end of an era, a dismal rehash of the methods and the language and the philosophy of the past.
From October 1967 and Pat Buchanan, vintage Ronald Reagan.
Listen, I'm honored to have worked for the Gipper as Director of Communications many years later, but that was the candidate I was most afraid of in the Republican primaries. It wasn't Nelson Rockefeller. It was the possibility that Ronald Reagan would get into the race, and given that personality, his conservative views, and the likability of him, that he could really stampede the old Goldwater delegates and really pull the nomination away from Richard Nixon. I never believed Rockefeller could get it after what he did to Barry Goldwater in 1964. I mean, Republicans would have walked out if Rockefeller had been nominated. Explain
the Reagan candidacy or possible candidacy in 1968. Sure. What was he thinking? Was he on the ballot? Was he a serious contender for the White House?
Sure. So what's fascinating about him from that clip particularly, as Pat said, the facility that he had with the audience and as a speaker. And of course that goes back to his days as an announcer for baseball, where he was getting the baseball game over the wire, but he was explaining it as if he was at the game. So he had a great facility for telling anecdotes and telling jokes, not to mention that he was a Hollywood actor. But he had made this interesting journey as the country, he sort of represented the country in that sense. He'd made this journey from a New Deal Roosevelt Democrat, the head of the Screen Actors Guild, the biggest Hollywood union there is, a pro-union man, to becoming more conservative as he worked for GE and was out on the banquet circuit for General Electric. And again, that's where he picked up this facility for the banquet speech and the political speech and telling the quip. It's very clear then to business people and to conservatives in California that he is the real heir to Goldwater. And he had come on the scene, particularly in politics, by that great speech that Reagan gave in 1964 supporting Goldwater. And so he ends up then in 68 as this right-wing challenge to Richard Nixon.
Let me, I believe, and and because of the letters of Nixon and Reagan, which I've got copies of, that there was a deal cut at Bohemian Grove in 1967 where Nixon and Reagan talked, where Nixon told Reagan, look, give me the first shot at Romney and the liberal establishment in New Hampshire, and if by Wisconsin I haven't succeeded really well, then you come in. And because there's a lot of exchange of, Rockefeller tried to have a meeting with Reagan down in New Orleans. It came up to his bedroom or something where he was staying at a hotel and knocked on the door and came in And Reagan was writing Nixon, and his people were calling Nixon, said, we didn't put this together. So that's my belief, that he gave Nixon that first shot. But there were Reagan people. They put him into Oregon. They sent a film out there. He got 22%, I think, at Oregon against us. We got 70. Rockefeller got 5% of the vote out there in Oregon in the primary, 28th of May.
But their hope was they could, Rockefeller and Reagan, that perhaps they could draw enough delegate votes away that if Nixon didn't win on the first ballot, right, in
Right.
Miami Beach, that maybe they
where
could.
would they go? See, if they started going to Reagan, the Rockefeller people would come to Nixon.
Yes.
They started going to Rockefeller, the Reagan people would have come to Nixon. So we were a good second ballot bet as well.
Yes.
Real quickly, did Richard Nixon consider Ronald Reagan as his running mate, even though they were both from California?
Let me tell you, there was we had his staff was up there in New York, and for a while in those days, you couldn't close a 6-point gap. At some points, Nixon was behind Humphrey in the polls by 6 points, and there was a number of us got together and sent Nixon a memo saying you got to put Reagan on the ticket. And Ray Price and I got in a violent argument out at Montauk Point over a vice president. You know, there was talk of Lindsay, even though he was from the same state. But whether Nixon was going to have to roll the dice and make a choice, a dramatic choice, and if he were going to do that, we thought it should be Reagan. But once the polls came out showing Nixon ahead, then you go with a moderate safe choice, like Spiro T. Agnew, a good centrist.
1968, year in turmoil, and our guest, Barbara Perry of the University of Virginia, and Pat Buchanan, syndicated columnist and author, and formerly with CNN, presidential candidate himself, and a Nixon aide in 1966, 67, and 68. Tony joining us from Prairieville, Louisiana, on our line for Republicans. Thank you for waiting.
Yes, I have a question or a comment and a question directed to Pat Buchanan. I've long held a belief that had Nixon won in 1960, he would have been a better candidate or a better president than he wound up being in 1968. And had he won in 1960, what does Pat Buchanan think Nixon would have done during his presidency following his election in 1960?
Thank you, Tony. Another what if?
What if? It's hard to know. I mean, Jack Kennedy's great moment was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know how Nixon would have handled that. My guess is Nixon was a more small C conservative. He would not have launched the Bay of Pigs, and if he had, he would have made sure that it worked. But you can't know these things, and of course there would have been no great society if Nixon were a two-term president. So there would have been real, in that sense, although, as you mentioned, a lot of what Nixon did was very progressive, and when he got in his mid-60s, mid-50s, he did not repeal the Great Society at all.
And let's add, Pat, another to your what if, and that is, what if Nixon had met with Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961? It would have had a different outcome, perhaps in the Bay of Pigs, although it was an Eisenhower plan that Nixon knew about, but couldn't go public with in the 1960 campaign. But wouldn't it have been interesting to see Nixon and Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961? Because historians think that because Kennedy didn't have such a good outing there with Khrushchev, that actually helped to precipitate the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Exactly. After he met with him, then came the Berlin Wall in August and the Missile Crisis. But Khrushchev, having met Nixon in the kitchen in 1959,
Yes.
did not like Nixon at all. As a matter of fact, it wasn't Gary Powers, but we had two other pilots, I think, had gone over Russian territory. And Khrushchev told folks that he didn't release them in 1960 so he could help Kennedy defeat Nixon. He didn't want to do something that, Nixon could claim credit for. But I think you're right. I think Khrushchev misjudged Kennedy, obviously, as soft and weak. And even Kennedy, what did he tell James Reston? He said, he beat the hell out of me in that meeting.
Savaged.
Yeah, in that meeting with
Yes.
Khrushchev. And I think Khrushchev took the measure of him as weak and made a grave mistake.
What was Richard Nixon's reaction on the night that Robert F. Kennedy won California and then was assassinated?
Well, I can tell you that was 3 a.m. in the East, and I got a call from the headquarters. Jeff Bell, who just died, was a young age, and Nixon, New Jersey, ran for Senate. But he was in his mid-20s, and he called me at my apartment, and I was asleep, and he woke me up and said, Bobby Kennedy's just been shot. And I called Nixon, and he said, I'm already up, that Julie and David, I think, had been watching the race, and it's fine. And so they had woken him up. So it's amazing. You know, 1 week before that, I was in Oregon when Nixon won on May 28th. He swept it, as I mentioned, 70%, and he went down to dinner with Pat Nixon in there. But I went out to the front door with Shelley, my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, because Bobby Kennedy was coming up from California to concede the race. And we saw Bobby get out of the car with Teddy White's, and he had the dog with him. And he went in, and I went down to the room to watch him concede that. And I remember telling folks there that that was a Bobby Kennedy I hadn't seen. He was at his most gracious. The concession speech to Eugene McCarthy was just very, I mean, it was everything you would expect. And he said, now, let's get on to California.
And think how hard that was for him to give that speech, the first Kennedy ever to lose an election.
Yeah. You know, I've read later that he was very down about it. Said, maybe I just can't win these folks, and I can't win the presidency. Because of McCarthy, of course, Eugene McCarthy, there was no better state for than the Oregon folks.
And no worse state for Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby Kennedy, exactly.
Yeah, for his constituency.
What was going through the country after the assassination of Senator Kennedy?
Well, a horrible shock, as you can imagine, and just imagine this, just 2 months after Martin Luther King's assassination. So here our political leaders, our social activists are being gunned down, and Bobby Kennedy, ironically, had been the person to rise up on that April 4th night, 1968 in Indianapolis, Indiana. They're campaigning for the Indiana primary, which he would win, his first primary, and gets the word as he comes into Indianapolis, going to speak to an African-American segment of Indianapolis, that Martin Luther King has been shot, and he tells the people, it's viewed as one of the best speeches ever in political history in the United States, and it's off the cuff. He has no script. He doesn't say our thoughts and prayers are with the King family. And you can hear the gasp in the audience. Indianapolis is the only major city that doesn't go up in flames that night. And so then to think that 2 months later he's assassinated. And I've written a biography of his mother, and his mother said, if this had been a story, if this had been a work of fiction, that this family would lose 2 of its sons running and in politics, running for a presidency and in the presidency, she said, I wouldn't have believed it. Mm-hmm. It was incomprehensible, that level of violence.
Dave from Northport, New York. Thank you for waiting. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I just want to say thank you to Mr. Buchanan for all the hard work and everything he's committed his life to. I used to enjoy watching him on McLaughlin. That was a great show. I would like to ask 2 quick questions, and that maybe more towards current events. I was curious about when you look at the Vietnam War and some of the bigger mistakes that we made there. Are we making, this is the path talk, are we making some of those same mistakes in Afghanistan after we've been there for 17 years? And also, I'm curious about what you think about Syria and the situation with Turkey coming in after the Kurds. We have a special forces based in Idlib, a strong Russian force in Syria, back in the Assad regime.
Thank you, Dave. You're breaking up, but we get the essence of the question, so thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think we've already made the mistake in the Middle East, frankly, that we made in Vietnam, was we went in without thinking through what the end of this intervention would be. I mean, the idea that we could turn Afghanistan into a sort of a quasi-Western country, or that once you overthrew the regime in Iraq, that we could work that all out when many of the people going in didn't know what Shia from Sunni. I agree with the late Bill Odom. I'm sure you had him on C-SPAN. The general said the movement into the Middle East militarily, all through there, is the worst diplomatic blunder in American political history.
Because of the Vietnam War, Barbara Perry, when did President Johnson begin to think that he would not serve another full term?
I think it's after the Tet Offensive that he realizes that even though, as I say, our forces, the U.S. military forces, won that battle, I'll use a crudity that is easy to find among Johnson comments, but he said, you know, if we pull back, for example, in Vietnam, if we halt the bombing, and remember that speech that he gave, withdrawing from the race at the end of March, was also to announce a halt to the bombing of the North. But he said, you know, later on, and he had to restart it in the summer, but he said, I pulled back in Vietnam, he said, Ho Chi Minh drives a truck up my ass. So he couldn't find the answer because there was no answer. So between that and then what he's seen on the campuses and the people, the students circling the White House chanting every day and every night, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And again, the answer was 1,000 Americans were dying a week in the rice paddies of Vietnam. So I think the combination of that, the combination that I think he says genuinely in that speech, look, I don't want to be taking time out on the political stump when I have all these other problems for the country that I need to address. And again, the personal issue that Johnson men and his family died young. He had already had 2 serious coronaries in the 1950s. And indeed, he barely lived to just after what would have been his second term, his second full term. He died in January of 1973. So imagine what the stress of being in that office for another 4 years would have done. He could well have died in office.
George is next, joining us from Titusville, Florida, Republican line. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN. I volunteered for the draft in '68, and I know the focus of the show is on '68 and the turmoil that occurred there. But my question is, 50 years from now, I think you could be doing another show on 2018, 2019, perhaps the Trump presidency, and the turmoil that this is creating. In '68, I think we had some sort of consciousness throughout the nation of the Constitution, the United States of America. Yeah, they were in the colleges. You had Columbia and all that. But there was more intelligence about it, and there was a lot of emotion. Today, as I look at the March on Washington, sorry to say this, but it's the march of the know-nothings. They have a lot of emotion, but they have very little intelligence. Everything is phrases, and so I'd like Pat to comment. And I wasn't one of your pitchfork people, but I've always appreciated your comments on Crossfire and all that.
George, thank you. We'll get a response. Thanks for the call.
You know, thanks very much, but I agree with the gentleman. I mentioned that I was in the teach-ins at Washington University in 1965, and when I went out there, the people, young people, questioned me. They knew the history of Vietnam back in the French and before then, what we were doing, the agreements in Geneva. They knew they were extremely intelligent. Later on, after Kent State, I went out and spoke at Kent State, and they were just emotional. And I would agree with him about yesterday. Maybe it's the film that was taken out, but the kids seemed full of passion and emotion and caught up and not a great deal of thought. Frankly, I can understand the passion in the immediate aftermath of that killing down there in Broward County. But that's what you got, so much passion as though we can, wave a magic wand and put an end to these school killings. And we can't do it. And the gentleman says that I think the generation does, and you can never know exactly, but the generation, I think, of the 1960s, the early to mid 60s, was intelligent in a lot of ways. Even when the liberal side, it was mature. It knew where it was going. It had ideas. Some of it, like the crowd up there at Columbia, Mark Penn and his friends, that helped us. I put out a statement that I think denouncing them for revolutionary takeover of our institution. And it got a 95-5 support in the polls.
Well, I think we should thank the caller for his service and for volunteering for the draft. And as I say, my brother's a Vietnam vet, so I'm very supportive of those veterans. But I'm always a little bit leery, particularly as a teacher and as a longtime professor of American government. It's a sign of aging, I think, to look back to a golden age, or a sign to say, oh, this new generation doesn't know anything. I think what this new generation knows is they do have passion, of course, those, as you say, who went through that horror in Florida several weeks ago. They also know social media. They know how to organize, and so they know how to be civically engaged. I think we did have better civic education that would have taught the baby boomers, and they were also directly impacted en masse, and they needed to know what was happening. They needed to know their rights because they were subject to the draft, or their friends or family were subject to the draft. But I do have hope for this generation. I'm glad they're taking part. I'm glad they're civically engaged. I would like a little bit more education.
Let me say, in '68, I don't think we can go back to '68, because what took place wasn't only this political revolution. I mean, Nixon putting together this new majority, or the beginnings of it, with the Wallace vote and pulling off the Catholics from Humphrey, but socially, culturally, morally, racially, and every other way, there was a huge cultural revolution going on in those years, which I think is ultimately, excuse me, prevailed in a way in the society and created divisions which exist and endure to this day. And while today is much less, it's not as violent as '68, which was a horrendously violent year, the most violent since the Civil War inside this country, I think that those divisions have endured and gone through several generations. And we got a country, it's hard for me to see how it ever comes together again. The way those of us who grew up in the Eisenhower and JFK era, the way it was together. I mean, I was a critic, an editorial writer taking on JFK. I read them now. I thought I was a tough editorial writer. They're very mild, you know. We disagree with the Area Redevelopment Act or something like that.
What happened to Senator Eugene McCarthy after the assassination of Robert Kennedy?
What happens to him is I listed out where he stood on the delegate count. At the moment Robert Kennedy had won the California primary and sadly then was assassinated, was that he was running a distant third. And so he became disaffected in the race. It became clearer as they got closer and closer to Chicago that Humphrey had the rank and file of the Democrats. He had the party bosses. He had Mayor Daley on his side, and that Gene McCarthy was not going to win the nomination. And in addition to that, we mentioned George McGovern. George McGovern was drafted by some of the pro-Kennedy forces. And so even though Robert Kennedy was now gone, there was another person in the race. So he became rather embittered by what had happened to him in the race. And he was
endorse Humphrey until the end of the race.
That's right, Pat. He waited until very, very late in the game.
Let me tell you just an anecdote of when I ran against the President George H.W. Bush in New Hampshire. I ran into Gene McCarthy, and I was going up to New Hampshire, and he said, don't worry, Pat, he said, when you get up there, you don't have to win, you just have to beat the point spread.
Larry from Houston, Texas, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm also a veteran, and the thing that I think caused Nixon to win was because youth had a cause. That all my friends, and a couple of them died in Vietnam as a result of it. And what it was that the draft just turned everybody away from the thought that we were going to have anything other than a war for the rest of our lives.
Thank you, Larry.
You know, in the draft, when I went to work with Nixon, I had come out, decided that we were going to have to do away with the draft because the country was coming apart. And secondarily, because we were beginning to draft people who basically in the barracks would have been seditious. They were so anti-war, they were so anti-military at the time, that in order to fight the war, future wars, you're probably going to have to end the draft. And I told, and Nixon, I've got a memo, Nixon talked to Eisenhower. And so I wrote Nixon a memo. I said, people are liable to say we're just doing this in order to let folks, you know, that are against the war not have to serve. And that's a bad thing. And Nixon wrote on it, Ike thinks so too. So Ike did not want that draft ended. I'll tell you who also pushed for it, end of the draft, a libertarian who joined us in '67, Martin Anderson, who was a young Nixon aide, one of the young men around Nixon, as I was then, Steve.
John from Austin, Texas. Go ahead, please. You're next.
Yes. Thank you for both of you, the panelists, for the discussion today. It's very good. I've got two quick questions. The first one is, how do you view the Democratic Party now versus 1968? It just seems to me that a lot of people who don't really love this country have taken over or the leadership of the Democratic Party. My other question is a what-if question. I usually stay away from what-if questions, but with the two panelists today, I think it's appropriate to ask. And the what-if question is, how do you think things would have worked out if Reagan had been elected president in 1968 instead of 1980?
John, thank you. Let's take the Democratic Party. Barbara Perry?
Sure. To Pat's point a few moments ago, I think that we come out of 1968 so polarized, and to Pat's point about now, I think that polarization is ossified within our system and within the parties. And so you don't see the big tent parties that we had in this country for so many years because we only have two major parties. And so they tended to be big tent parties, maybe not in their primaries necessarily, but typically they would take in people from different parts of the political spectrum. And we see that polarization, I think, to this day, certainly in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. I don't accept that people in the Democratic Party, leaders or rank and file, are unpatriotic or un-American. I don't see that at all. They just have a different view of the America that they want to lead or that they support.
And a follow-up on the state of the Democratic Party in 1968. How strongly was President Johnson supporting Hubert Humphrey? Was he focused on politics or was his focus on Vietnam?
Well, the problem for Johnson was that even if he had supported him to the hilt, he couldn't go out and campaign for him because, first of all, it was too dangerous. The Secret Service did not want him to go, for example, on college campuses, which was another reason why he thought, I can't run myself. So he was not able to go out on the stump and do much campaigning for him. I think you might say maybe much as Eisenhower didn't go out full-throatedly for Nixon in 1960. So Johnson, I think, was supportive, but he also had that tension with Humphrey, and Humphrey had tension with him over the war.
And Pat Buchanan, Ronald Reagan, 1968, had he won, a what-if question?
He would have gone for victory in Vietnam. I think, I think he would have ended the bombing. Johnson declared, the one thing Johnson did do for Humphrey is in that last week, I think it was on October 31st, declared a bombing halt in Vietnam. And Humphrey had, people forget, Humphrey, at the beginning of October, it was Nixon 43, Humphrey 28, Wallace 21. By the time the race ended, it was 43 all. Much of the Wallace vote in the North moved to Humphrey and some of the Nixon vote. And so he had a tremendous campaign there. And the bombing halt, I think, almost put Humphrey over. But then the North Vietnamese did not, or excuse me, the South Vietnamese, President Chu declined to come to Paris for the meeting. And that bollocked it up on the weekend, and it's a cause of a great controversy right now. I was with Nixon then. But that's, with regard to Reagan, Reagan was young. You saw the Reagan there. That's a different Reagan than I saw in the White House in '85, which would have been almost 20 years on. And I think Reagan would have gone for victory in Vietnam, and he would go on all-out bombing and used American power, and there would have been, I think, no limits on going into Laos or Cambodia.
One other timeline issue. Late September, Vice President Humphrey travels to Salt Lake City to do what?
He gives a speech in which he finally comes out against the Johnson policy on the Vietnam War. And he speaks up in favor of peace and going to peace talks and de-Americanization of the war. And some people think if he had just done that earlier, because as Pat said, he was coming on strong at the end, in part perhaps because of Johnson's decisions. But you also made a reference to President Tu of South Vietnam, and there's a great book called Chasing Shadows by my colleague Ken Hughes at the Miller Center about the back-channeling that was being done between the Nixon campaign and President Tu about the peace talks.
That's a matter of some controversy.
We might do a whole show on that.
George, Bloomington, Illinois, Republican line. Go ahead with your question, George.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I have a question of Mr. Buchanan and Ms. Perry concerning President Johnson's tardiness in supporting Hubert Humphrey in '68 until that very late date. And I'm wondering if it's sort of a what-if question again, but what if the president had come out sooner for Humphrey? Ms. Perry alluded to the tension between Humphrey and Johnson over the war, and it was palpable.
George, thank you.
Yes, so indeed, there will always be this historical what if. What if Humphrey had, and I think it was against his personality, because he was such a joyful, positive, ebullient character, and such a loyal character, that it was really hard for him to turn against his president. But I think it is possibly the case that if he had come out sooner and drawn the people who were supportive of McCarthy, the anti-war activists, supportive of Robert Kennedy, the far left fringe he was not going to get. They were going to be against him, as was indicated in Chicago. But I think if he had come out earlier against the Johnson policy, maybe Humphrey would have gotten what he needed in the popular vote. But as Pat well knows, Nixon so flooded him on the Electoral College vote that it's really hard to put together.
Which brings us to this map, Pat Buchanan. This is the 1968 electoral map, and you can see a very different country back then, with the Republicans winning states like California and winning the upper Midwest, the Democrats winning states like Texas, and of course the Midwest and New England. And then there's George Wallace in the South.
Got 5 states. At one point he had 7. He had both Carolinas, I think. Yeah, he took those states away, and one of the reasons Nixon picked Agnew, and Agnew had a hard position, tough, hard line on riots. He'd been very tough on H. Rap Brown down there in Cambridge when they burned that town down, and Stokely Carmichael had come to Baltimore. And I went, as a matter of fact, Humphrey, you mentioned Humphrey. Humphrey was gaining, and I was if you can believe it, we're campaigning on Long Island. I went to the president and said, or the president, Mr. Nixon, I said, you know, I'm not doing any good here. We've just got the same old message. Let me go out, I can help Agnew. So I went out and spent a week on Agnew's plane. He were going down through the upper South with Spiro T. Agnew to win that area. So I do think that Hubert Humphrey, if he had moved earlier, would have done better. And one reason is his campaign from September to that Salt Lake City speech was bedeviled everywhere with dump the hump and obscene comments, and he finally got to the point himself, he was denouncing fascism out here. They won't let me speak. Teddy Kennedy, he was being denounced in Massachusetts with Teddy Kennedy. But when he delivered that Salt Lake City speech, it turned for Humphrey, and he began really moving up the hill at a tremendous clip. And I remember going to Nixon and saying, we have to attack Humphrey to drive the wedge back through the party because it's coming together.
Very quickly.
We didn't do a thing.
Who was George Wallace?
Oh, George Wallace, what a colorful character. Pat and I were talking before the show today, and he said he used to go speak with him, so we'll want Pat to weigh in. But he was a populist, eventually segregationist. He was not in his earlier life in Alabama, but he was a World War II veteran. We look back now and realize he may have suffered from some PTSD from his service in the Pacific theater of war. He was a bantamweight, pugilistic kind of fighter, and by the late 50s, when he lost a race in 1958, I will not use the N-word, but he said he would not be out-end again by someone else, and so he really turned towards the right, the segregationist view, and the anti-civil rights view, and he brings that on into the 1968 campaign, not to think that he was going to win. He knew that he probably wouldn't carry any states outside the South, though, as Pat said, he carried 5 of them, but he thought that he could be the broker if there was not an electoral majority for one of the 2 major candidates.
Or he could put it in the House, right. But here's the thing, Wallace had come out in '64, and he'd run in the Democratic primaries, and he'd done very well in Wisconsin and Indiana. Right here next door in Maryland, Wallace got a majority of the white vote in the Democratic primary in 1964, and LBJ was president of the United States. And then he comes in '68 and he announces this third-party run. And what he did then was, he was not only a segregationist, though. He was strict segregation, he got that vote. But he was also a real populist. He was bashing the students and the demonstrators, and I know some 4-letter words too. SOAP and WORK. But I got to know him. You know, I went down after I left Nixon, I got to know him, and I would go down to Alabama, and I would speak at the regularly, I had a chair at Troy State, and I'd get to the airport, and state trooper would be there, and I'd be with my wife, and he would say, the governor would like to speak to you. And I was after he had been shot out in Laurel in the '72 campaign. And I would go to his office, and we would tell old stories of the campaigns and how he did against Lindsay down. He used to talk trash to the reporters, but he was quite a guy. And later on in his life, he sort of felt badly about a lot of the things he had done. But 1963 was segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever.
And standing in the schoolhouse door in 1963 as President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy tried to integrate the University of Alabama per the federal court orders.
I think it was choreographed. He stood in the schoolhouse door, Katzenbach came, they nationalized the guard, and then he stepped aside and it all came off. Everybody got what they wanted.
Yeah, and it worked for him politically. His big mistake was in choosing Curtis LeMay, the Air Force general, as his vice presidential nominee, who was making comments.
That was in 60, yes it was.
Yeah, that was in 68.
Came out, yeah, Curtis LeMay came out and they asked him, what about nuclear weapons? He said, you know, people are too frightened of these things. You know, we tested them out in Bikini Atoll and everything was fine. Although the sand crabs were a little hot after.
people thought Barry Goldwater might use them in '64, but LeMay was saying, let's do it.
The hydrogen bomb was tested out there.
Pat Buchanan is the author of The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority, joining us here at the table along with Barbara Perry, who is the Director of Presidential Studies at UVA's Miller Center. Andy from Owensboro, Kentucky. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you all. I'd like to thank Mr. Buchanan because he's been a good servant for the United States and everything, and take my hat off to you, Mr. Buchanan. My question is, I was born in 1962. I'm 55 now. Of course, I love politics. Do you think that there will ever be like any more conservative Democrats? I know there was some back then. And I know there's still conservative Democrats out there. Do you think that there's any that will arise in the future?
Thank you, Andy.
Socially, culturally, no. I think that we saw this with the Lipinski battle out in Illinois, who's a pro-life Democrat. They tried to defeat him and almost did. He's an incumbent congressman. I think on social, cultural, moral issues, the Democratic Party has made its move. I think the fact that they lost the entire South, which was something that kept them to a degree conservative. I don't think you're ever going to see it. As a matter of fact, I think younger Americans, the millennials, seem to me, while there's pro-lifers, the majority seem to me to be of the left. And I think the Democratic Party is going to be pulled to the left. The real danger for it in the coming election, I think, is that the left nominates its candidate in the sense the way McGovern did. They did in 1972 when they nominated McGovern and pulled the party so far to the left that Nixon, who of course was centrist, progressive Republican, but hard line on law and order, gave him 49 states. Republicans aren't going to win 49 states ever again. But I think the Democratic Party is never going to be conservative
Well,
again.
we'll see in the midterms, won't we? And I would say maybe someone like Connor Lamb may be as conservative as the Democrats will go, but it was an interesting choice and a successful one. I would say to the caller from Owensboro, Kentucky, who's from the hometown of one of my political mentors was Wendell Ford, who became the majority whip in the Senate and was a conservative Democrat from Kentucky. But now there are really no such things because Kentucky is a red state, it's a Republican state, and it's got Republicans not only throughout the Senate delegation, but throughout the House delegation itself.
You know, when I went into politics in '66, there was one Republican senator in the entire old Confederacy, John Tower, and he'd gotten that as a result of LBJ becoming vice president. So then we got Howard Baker in 1966 in Tennessee, but now it's the reverse is true.
It's the reverse.
Raymond from Cleveland, Ohio, independent line with Pat Buchanan and Barbara Perry.
How do we go from 1968 to Kent State, and how do we deal with, we didn't have the social media and the internet back then. How did people organize?
Interesting question. Barbara Perry.
How do we go from 1968 to 1970 in Kent State? The question is, and the answer is Nixon opening up the Cambodian front in the Vietnam War, and that is to invade Cambodia to try to stop the flow of men and materiel from the north into the south and to be used against United States forces there in South Vietnam. With the announcement of that in April of 1970, the campuses explode again, particularly Kent State. There's a peaceful demonstration, but the Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on the protesting students, and several of them are killed. So that is yet another open wound for the United States to have to deal with. How did these people organize? I just watched a fascinating documentary last night about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and the media. And without social media, the way to get to the media in those days, of course, social media is now a bit of a misnomer. Media is supposed to be between the government and the people. Now we are the media. The people are the media. But it's what Pat was saying about how to reach the media in the Nixon campaign, how to do good advance work to get people out when you're having a rally or having a demonstration. So it was word of mouth, it was telephones, it was telegrams, and it was old-fashioned hard copy letters.
You know, I wrote the speech with Nixon, the Cambodian invasion speech, and it was very dramatic because I think it was April 1, it was 1970.
Yes.
And what happened was 3 or 4, they did have riots out at Kent, the town. That's why the National Guard was called in by Governor Rhodes. He made a rough speech on Sunday, and Monday the students were up there and they were approaching these guardsmen who foolishly had their live ammunition in their rifles. But they shot these, 4 of them died. I think there were about 5 more wounded or something. And I remember I was home and I wasn't feeling well, and I got my fellow that worked for me, Mort Allen, called and he said, there's 4 kids shot at Kent State. I said, where is Kent State? But word went around. That's where Nixon came closer to being broken by something than any time I've ever seen in that month of April. Remember, that's the time he left the White House on the Friday after Kent State, went over to the Lincoln Memorial at 4 in the morning where all these students were gathering, then took B.B. Rebozo with him and went down on Manolo, the fellow that worked for him, put him up in the speaker's chair in the Congress, went over to the Mayflower for breakfast. In the early hours, he was really moved by what had happened there. And the White House was tremendously divided over it. Most White House aides didn't want the invasion of Cambodia, didn't like the invasion of Cambodia, and urged Nixon to go much further in sort of accommodating the students. But that was the roughest time of Nixon's presidency, I recall, in the first term.
We're looking at 1968, really beginning with Eugene McCarthy's decision to seek the Democratic nomination in the fall of 1967. We will look at the timeline as we listen to Garrett from Orlando, Florida.
Good morning. Very edifying. Thank you both. I'd just like to ask or have you comment on the Dump Johnson campaign that was by congresmen and the legislatures, and maybe in particular, maybe mention Mr. Howard K. Lowenstein.
Thank you, Garrett. Barbara Perry.
Sure. I mentioned a little while ago that Johnson was bouncing down into the low 30s, mid to low 30s in the approval ratings. You know, nothing will get members of a president's party attention in Congress like really low approval ratings for the president. So that's part of the Dump Nixon movement. You mentioned Allard K. Lowenstein of New York. He was pushing Robert Kennedy to join the race as an anti-war candidate. One thing we haven't mentioned that came out in Ted Kennedy's oral history that he did with us at the Miller Center, where we do typically presidential oral history, but he came to us to do his oral history after 40 years in the Senate. And he told the story of being deputed by his brother Bobby to go out to the Midwest to speak to Eugene McCarthy, to say, you know, Bobby's considering getting in the race, but if you will put near or at the top of your agenda, in addition to being anti-war, to looking into the issues of poverty, rural poverty, urban poverty, that Bobby Kennedy had embraced at that point, Bobby will reconsider getting into the race. And according to Ted Kennedy, Gene McCarthy said, no, anti-war is at the top of my platform. So that was the movement of Lowenstein trying to get Bobby to get into the race.
Lowenstein tried to get a number of people. I think he tried to get McGovern, didn't he?
That may be.
I think so, and McGovern said, why don't you go talk to Eugene McCarthy?
Donna from St. Louis, Missouri, where Pat Buchanan spent many time in the 1960s. Go ahead, Donna.
That's true. Good morning. I have a question for Pat. But first, I just want to say I was an independent and went to California and was a delegate for you in 2000. And I also had a nice chat with Brian Lamb while I was there. It was an exciting experience.
Long Beach.
Yes. And my question is, there was a time when I supported the Vietnam War in the mid-'60s. I was in high school and graduated in '66. You knew it was unwinnable, though, with all the Chinese pouring in there, as they did in Korea. Why didn't we handle Vietnam like Truman handled Korea? I've always wondered that.
Well, with Truman, Korea drove Truman out of the White House, and it was General Eisenhower who came in and decided that we're not going for victory. And you had a DMZ where the two armies were lined up, and he threatened the Chinese, and he got basically an armistice. With Vietnam, you had a much different story. I mean, the Chinese were actually not in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were in the south. But it's a very good question. I mean, looking back, and obviously anybody that's been involved in any way, and I wasn't over there, but I was writing speeches in the White House and working for Nixon as an aide before he ran. You got to ask yourself afterwards, the Vietnam War accomplished a lot of good things. It held the line in Southeast Asia, and all those countries did not move with the Chinese or toward communism from Indonesia all around, but moved toward the West. But should we have gone in the first place?
Barbara Perry, was Richard Nixon undercutting the Johnson administration in trying to keep the war going through the election of 1968, saying you'll get a better deal with me?
Well, that's what the latest literature, the historical literature, says about that question. But I'm going to pass it over to Pat because I think he was there and he will know the answer to it. But the historians are saying, yes, that indeed Nixon was back-channeling with Anna Chennault.
Who was what?
So Anna Chennault, as I understand, was the widow of Claire Chennault, General Chennault from World War II, and was the go-between between, according to the historians' literature now, the Nixon camp and the South Vietnamese, encouraging President Thieu of South Vietnam to hold off on participating in peace talks, get a better deal under Nixon. And remember, Nixon was saying that he had a plan to end the war, so he was being very public about that. But I'll let Pat address the behind-the-scenes issues.
Yeah, I don't credit what recent authors have said about this. I was with Nixon, and I had nothing to do with it. I remember going in to see him that Saturday before the election and telling him a friend of mine had called, John Sears, and said, Michigan's gone and we're down 3 nationally in the Harris poll. And so we were in tough shape. But let me say this, there are reasons why I don't. First, President Thieu did not need anybody to tell him that Richard Nixon was going to take a harder line than Hubert Humphrey, after Humphrey said, I will halt the bombing as soon as I get elected. Secondly, if there was some kind of, signal sent, where are the tapes that LBJ, who wiretapped planes and who wiretapped people, why didn't President Thieu, who came out of Vietnam, say, the reason I did this was this? And none of these main actors were questioned or came forward to validate the suggestion that Nixon told Mitchell or someone to tell Mrs. Chennault to tell President Thieu, don't go, you'll get a better deal from Nixon. I mean, this is not a dumb man. He's been at war for any number of years. So I don't believe that came off. And one fellow wrote the book recently and said, Nixon told Haldeman when he heard about the bombing halt, throw a monkey wrench into this, He used that phrase all the time about everything. So I just don't validate it.
Well, I don't know if there are tapes of the wiretaps, but there are tapes of President Johnson talking about this issue that you can listen to, and that he told Humphrey this was happening. Humphrey refused to release it.
Humphrey said he didn't believe it, too.
Yeah, he refused to release it.
From Gaithersburg, Maryland, Phil, go ahead, please. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having Ms. Perry and Mr. Buchanan on. They're two fabulous guests, and I appreciate that, C-SPAN. And my comment is, I was a history student at the University of Maryland in 1968, and the college campus behavior, it seems to me, 50 years ago was quite different than it is today. Many points of view were listened to. Many points of view could be tolerated. Today, it seems to be that college campus behavior is much more progressive, and anyone who disagrees is silenced.
I agree 100%. I think, as I say, I was out there at teach-ins. They were hearing our view. They didn't like our views if you supported the war, but they invited you out there, and they invited pro-war and anti-war speakers on campus. And but today, you get a real sense of intolerance and a sense of that we have found the truth, and we don't want to hear any more dissent, and certain forms of dissent are racist and bigoted and homophobic and things like that. And that goes to the idea that one side in the cultural war is evil, and there's only one good side.
Two final points. This is a headline from the Smithsonian website. In 1968, when Nixon said, "Sock it to me" on Laugh-In, TV was never quite the same. It is very brief. It's only 5 seconds. Listen carefully.
Sock it to me?
Why was this significant?
Well, it was because Nixon basically was the stiff. He was considered stiff and correct, and he was not with it. And that was a real sort of progressive type show. And I didn't think it was a good idea. But I think Paul Keyes, who was a very good friend of Nixon and was a writer for Rowan and Martin, I believe, he persuaded Nixon to do it.
Well, Pat says he was considered, uptight and stiff and also sweaty from 1960 in the debates with Jack Kennedy. So to go on a hip and happening show and to sort of make fun of himself by saying "sock it to me," as if I don't really even know what that is, but they told me to say it. But it's a turning point, I think, for politicians to go into popular culture.
In our remaining minute, with a half a minute for each of you, the lessons from 1968, Barbara Perry, what are they?
Well, I think that we've touched on some of them already, and they are this increasing polarization, I think, is kicked off. The polarization that we see today in the parties and in today's culture. Pat's made reference to culture wars. We still see those today. And I also think that there is a linkage between 1964 and Barry Goldwater, his brand of right-wing populism in through the Reagan years and Nixon to some extent, but Reagan with movement conservatism and all the way up to Donald Trump. So I think we see some of the seeds of both the Democratic left and the Republican right, and Democratic populism and Republican populism to this day.
Pat Buchanan, we give you the final word.
I think that's very true. What you see is that Goldwater sort of laid this foundation with this powerful conservative movement, which basically captured the party but couldn't capture the country. And Nixon picked up that movement and brought that Republican Party together, and then picked up the two pieces of the Democratic Party, the Northern Catholics and Southern Protestants, created a new majority that won for Republicans 5 out of 6 presidential elections after 1964, which was astounding considering the defeat then. But you're right, in the Democratic Party, the Eugene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy, George McGovern wing would capture the party and nominate McGovern in '72. But I think what you've got subsequent to '68, that year we really crossed a continental divide. And we've never been able to get back over that divide, I think, and it's because it involves more than simply politics. It involves the most fundamental beliefs about men, about right and wrong, and good and evil, and justice and injustice. And there's just very little upon which you find that Americans really agree these days.
For your insights, your perspective, and your stories, Barbara Perry of the University of Virginia and Pat Buchanan, to both of you, thank you for being with us.
Good to see you, friend.
Our pleasure.